The scene opens with Kim Dan, a young boy, being relentlessly bullied by a group of children. They point and laugh, their voices dripping with cruelty. Kim Dan is a dum-dum, they chant, their mockery echoing in the air. He doesn't have a mommy, he doesn't have a daddy. It's evident that this harsh behavior has become normalized among them, likely because no one has taught them to act otherwise. Their parents seem to have neglected the lesson of compassion, failing to guide them against bullying someone simply for being an orphan. As the taunts persist, they repeatedly call Kim Dan a bum, just because he lacks parents. Poor Kim Dan, too young and vulnerable, sits there, tears streaming down his face. His small frame trembles as he sobs, sniffling pitifully, completely consumed by his sorrow. When he can no longer bear the torment, Kim Dan races home, seeking solace. He finds his grandmother and collapses into her arms, sobbing uncontrollably. She wraps him in a warm embrace, gently patting his back, trying to soothe him. "Don't cry, sweetie," she says softly. "They don't understand. You still have me." But Kim Dan's tears continue to flow. In a bid to distract him, she asks, "Would you like a snack?" Kim Dan hesitates, then meets her gaze with tear-filled eyes. She quickly finds him a treat, and as he begins to eat, his cries gradually subside. Sitting down, munching on a snack, Kim Dan starts to feel a flicker of comfort. His grandmother approaches and affectionately pats his head, reassuring him, "Don't worry. Grandma will always be here for you." For a fleeting moment, a smile breaks through Kim Dan's pain. "Okay," he replies cheerfully. But then, the warm scene shifts unexpectedly. He looks back to where his grandmother should be standing, only to find an empty doorway leading into darkness. Panic surges as young Kim Dan jumps to his feet and races toward the void. "Grandma! Grandma! Where are you?" he cries, his voice quaking. He plunges into the darkness, reaching out desperately. "Grandma, where did you go? You promised you'd always be there for me." His shouts grow louder, echoing through the emptiness, filled with fear and desperation. Tears cascade down his cheeks as he pleads, "Grandma, don't leave. I don't want to be alone." In an instant, the figure of young Kim Dan morphs into that of the grown-up Kim Dan. He still sobs, calling out for his grandmother in a faint, broken voice. "Grandma, don't go," he begs. "I don't want to be alone." The scene shifts abruptly. Kim Dan awakens in his bed, his face damp with tears. He realizes he's been trapped in a nightmare. Slowly, he sits up and rubs his face, trying to steady himself. "When did I fall asleep?" he wonders aloud. The door creaks open, and an elderly man steps inside. "Are you awake, son?" he asks kindly. Kim Dan looks up and replies, "Yes." The man nods and says, "Well, come on out and have some breakfast." As Kim Dan steps out of his room, he sees the breakfast the man has prepared. The food looks warm and inviting, but as he sits down, a pang of guilt washes over him. "I'm sorry," he murmurs softly. "This should have been my job." The old man chuckles, dismissing Kim Dan's apology with a wave. "Nonsense. You're always coming in late, aren't you?" Kim Dan has no response, simply sitting quietly and allowing the old man to take the lead in their conversation. The old man continues, "Besides, you already pay rent. Why not just feed the dogs later?" With that, the discussion comes to an end. Just then, their family dog, Boksun, trots up to the table, barking happily and wagging her tail. Kim Dan bends down to pat her head, asking warmly, "Hey, Boksun, did you sleep well?" The dog pants joyfully, clearly relishing the attention. The old man observes the interaction and comments, "Look at her belly. She'll pop any day now." Kim Dan nods in agreement. "Yeah, she will." Then the old man surprises him with a question. "Do you want to take one of her pups with you when you move back to Seoul?" Kim Dan hesitates, taken aback by the offer, before quickly shaking his head. "No, thank you. I don't think I can raise a dog." The old man raises an eyebrow, intrigued. "Really? Do you live in an apartment or something?" Kim Dan grows visibly nervous, unsure how to explain his situation in Seoul. He avoids the question, looking away. Sensing the shift in mood, The old man changes the topic. Anyway, I noticed you were drinking again last night. You wouldn't make an old man clean up a mess, would you? Kim Dan brushes off the comment with a faint smile. No, he thanks the old man for the meal and quietly finishes eating. The scene shifts to the Light of Hope Hospice, where Kim Dan is currently working. He assists an elderly patient alongside a coworker. It's a long, exhausting day, and by the end of it, Kim Dan feels utterly drained. He finds a quiet corner by a cabinet to rest, and eventually dozes off. A passing nurse notices him slumped over in exhaustion. Is he really that tired? She wonders aloud but decides not to wake him. Later, while feeding his grandmother, fatigue catches up to Kim Dan again, and he starts to nod off. His grandmother immediately notices. Dan, she says gently, didn't you get much sleep last night? Her voice jolts him awake. Embarrassed, Kim Dan stammers, oh no, I did. I'm fine. He quickly regains his composure and, in an effort to lighten the mood, asks with a bright smile, how about a walk after you finish eating? The ocean looks beautiful today. His grandmother pauses, surprised by his sudden suggestion. But her expression softens, and she sighs. Oh dear, it seems like you're wearing down a bit more each day, she says, holding his hand with a mix of love and concern. Her tone grows serious as she adds, Dan, why don't you consider going back to Seoul? Kim Dan freezes, momentarily stunned by her words. She continues, you can't stay here forever, and it's not like you'll stick around after I'm gone. This isn't your hometown. You don't have ties here. It's time for you to live your life. She looks at him tenderly. This is all because I wanted to see the ocean, right? I've been worried sick about you since you moved here. Kim Dan tries to reassure her, forcing a smile. I'm fine, Grandma, he says softly, squeezing her hand. Don't worry about me. I'll decide what's best. Right now, I just want to be by your side. The scene shifts to Kim Dan walking through the hospice corridors, deep in thought. His mind drifts back to Seoul. His grandmother wants him to return, but before leaving, he was living in Jae-kyung's extravagant house. Memories of tension flood his mind, and he shakes his head sharply, trying to dispel the thoughts. No, what am I thinking? He mutters to himself. As he walks, he passes through a common area where elderly patients are gathered, watching the news on a large TV screen. The reporter's voice fills the room. In other news, here's the latest on MMA fighter Ju Jae-kyung. In an exclusive interview, one of his close associates reveals that the athlete has been focusing on his recovery. The MFC has expressed disappointment over his loss, and it remains unclear when he will compete again. The question on everyone's mind, can Ju Jae-kyung make a comeback amidst this backlash? The patients react almost instantly. One elderly man, visibly frustrated, exclaims, with that attitude, he had it coming. He got injured because he's a jerk. Another chimes in, a fool, if I ever saw one. Such a shame to waste his youth like that. Kim Dan stands silently, listening to their remarks. The words sting as memories resurface, particularly of the incident when he sprayed Jae-kyung's leg, contributing to his loss. A wave of guilt crashes over him, and he lowers his head, gritting his teeth. It's all my fault, he thinks. Mr. Joe, Grandma too. If only I had taken Grandma to see a doctor sooner, she wouldn't be suffering like this now. And back then, if only I hadn't used that spray. I should have realized. His guilt gnaws at him, leaving him restless and heavy-hearted. Later that night, the scene shifts to Kim Dan's home. The floor is littered with empty bottles, remnants of his attempts to drown his guilt in alcohol. Amidst the mess, he stands up in frustration, kicking over a glass and spilling its contents across the floor. Barefoot, he storms outside into the cold night air. The ground feels rough beneath his feet, but he doesn't care. As he walks aimlessly, he thinks to himself, looking back, I have nothing but regrets. The next morning, the seaside hospice bustles with activity. Reporters and cameramen gather outside the building, a strange sight for the sleepy town. Inside, the nurses watch the commotion from the windows, curious and confused. One nurse wonders aloud, what are all these cars doing here in such a small town? Another replies, I heard they're filming something. They'll be here for a few weeks. A third nurse, intrigued, asks, really? Do you know which big star is coming? In the midst of this chatter, Kim Dan, moving hurriedly, stumbles against a table. One of the nurses notices and rushes over. Oh my God, are you okay, Doc Dan? Kim Dan tries to brush her off. Yes, I'm fine. Just a little dizzy. That's all, he says weakly. The nurse's concerned gaze doesn't waver. You were on duty yesterday. Why are you still here? If I'm not mistaken, you were relieved from your afternoon shift. Kim Dan hesitates before explaining, I stay behind to spend time with my grandma. The nurse shakes her head firmly. Well, you should go home. You're clearly in no state to work. He starts to protest, but she cuts him off. No buts. Go home now. Defeated and too tired to argue, Kim Dan agrees. Okay, I'm off then, he mutters, looking worn out as he heads out of the hospice. As he walks away, the nurses glance at him with concern. One sighs, Doc Dan has been looking really burned out lately. The other nods. Right. I'm worried about him. If he's caring for his grandmother, he should take care of himself too. Unaware of their concern, Kim Dan steps outside and walks in a daze. Lost in thought. Once home, he lays down beneath a shaded tree, the sound of rustling leaves offering a brief comfort. But his peace is short-lived. The old man approaches, breaking the silence. You're back early today, he remarks. Kim Dan looks up to see him standing there. Before he can respond, the old man adds, I thought you'd already gone back to Seoul. Is work keeping you that busy? Come with me for a second. Without waiting for a reply, the old man leads Kim Dan to the dog shed. Inside, Bok-sun is nursing her newborn puppies. Kim Dan's eyes widen in surprise and delight. Wow, he breathes. This is amazing. The old man grins. She had them while you were gone, he explains, bending down to pick up one of the puppies. Holding it out to Kim Dan, he says, ain't she a beauty? Bok-sun doesn't mind you handling her pups. Kim Dan gently takes the puppy, cradling it in his hands. You're right, he says softly. It's so cute. The old man claps him on the back. I'm heading out to the fields now. I've got some fish stew in the kitchen. Make sure to give Bok-sun some later. Sure, Kim Dan replies. As the old man leaves, he adds, Bok-sun's always wandering around. Who knows if she ever gets around to eating. Left alone, Kim Dan looks down at the dog and says, You're amazing, Bok-sun. Thanks to you, I feel a lot better now. Bok-sun continues to lick her pups, blissfully unaware of her impact. The peace is shattered by murmured voices in the distance. Startled, Bok-sun perks up, her ears twitching. One of the newcomers says, I'm pretty sure I spotted her around here earlier. Before Kim Dan can react, Bok-sun bolts toward the sound, tail wagging excitedly. The sudden movement startles Kim Dan. Bok-sun, he calls out, scrambling to follow her. As he approaches, he hears the voices more clearly. How did you become friends so fast? One voice asks. She was just friendly from the get-go, another replies. I even gave her a treat. Hearing these voices causes Kim Dan to pause mid-step. His eyes widen in shock. The familiarity of the voices is unmistakable. His heart races as he follows the trail, and when he finally catches up, he sees Bok-sun greeting the newcomers, her tail wagging furiously. At that moment, the newcomers spot Kim Dan. Their eyes lock, both parties freezing in mutual surprise. One of them breaks the silence, calling out, Kim Dan,